Singularity.
Konnichiwa. Wonderful to be here. It's an honor to be here. The last speaker was excellent, and I will try to expand on his themes. My name is Ramez Naam, and I am talking today about the disruption of the largest industry on Earth. The energy industry is $6 trillion US per year, 600 trillion yen per year. As you've heard, my background is actually computer science. I worked at Microsoft for 13 years. I've run a tech startup. And in my spare time, I write science fiction about the brain. But that's not the topic for today. We are going to talk about energy globally, but we have to pay some attention to Japan specifically. That's where we are. And Japan has some specific issues. Japan has some of the most expensive electricity in the world. These are major economies around the world, and you see Japan at the 6th most expensive electricity around the world. This is the retail price for end consumers, and that's twice as expensive as the average electricity price in the US, and almost 3 times as expensive as average retail electricity in China. And so that puts Japan at a disadvantage for energy-intensive industries. We also see the shift since the shutdown of nuclear in Japan. The imports of fossil fuels, the red line, have gone up, and of course the nuclear line went down. And so now there are questions of what to do. How do we provide Japan's energy supply? Energy is also a major source of imports for Japan, and thus it's money leaving the country. Japan imports 50 billion US dollars, 5 trillion yen of oil every year, and nearly $100 billion per year total of oil, gas, and coal. And that's money that, if those resources were developed locally on the island, would stay inside of Japan's economy. The good news for Japan and the world is that technology is disrupting this industry. This is Peabody Coal. This was the largest coal company in the world, the largest privately held coal company, largest coal company in the US, worked at enormous scale. Peabody Coal is now bankrupt. As you heard from the last speaker, the top 4 coal companies in the US all went bankrupt within a 3-year period. They went bankrupt because of disruption. The first disruption was fracking and cheap natural gas in the US. But now the disruption of coal is going global, and it is more tied to renewables and the declining cost of clean energy. Let me start with the one that you know the most about already, solar. Solar power is incredibly abundant. The sun hits our planet with 10,000 times more energy than we need. And as you saw from the previous speaker, the cost has plunged incredibly. A 250 times reduction in the cost of a watt of solar panel material in less than my lifetime, actually. That is not as fast as digital, but it's more like digital than anything else. Nothing else in physical industry has declined in price this fast. Not the cost of building buildings, not the cost of making trains, automobiles, anything like that. This is more like a digital revolution than any of those. And scale drives down prices. Here's a fundamental thing to understand about solar power and exponential technologies. If you take the cost of solar, not as a function of time, but as a function of how big is the industry, how many solar panels have been made, that's the horizontal axis, and price is the vertical axis. It follows a straight line on a log-log curve. And in fact, this is true not just for solar. This is true for microprocessors, memory, integrated circuits. It's true for airplanes. It's true for the Ford Model T, the first car. This is called the learning curve. And this is a fundamental attribute of all exponential technologies, and it's important from a business model standpoint. Because when you have a new exponential technology in energy, AI, biotechnology, any of these, initially it is expensive. And so what has to happen for this to grow, you have to find a first market where while it's still expensive, it has value. For solar, that was solar panel on satellites. For AI, it might be something else. For biotech, something else. But then once you get into that market, you get some volume and your prices fall. And when your prices fall a little bit, you tap into a new market where now the product is cheap enough to add value in this new market. And when you tap into that new market, it's usually larger than the old market, and so the demand goes up. And because the demand has gone up, you capture the learning curve and the prices fall again. It's a virtuous cycle. So we see that happening with solar now. And now it will accelerate. It will take off on its own, almost independent of policy, because now we're at crossover. By crossover, I mean the point at which solar in sunny parts of the world is simply the cheapest energy you can buy, period. This is a natural gas plant in the US. That's where the natural gas is the cheapest in the world. Costs 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour, less than half of what it does in Japan. Okay, so use that reference, 5 or 6 yen per kilowatt hour, if you will. It's also what you'd pay for coal electricity in China, for instance. Well, in China, we now have 6 cent a kilowatt hour solar in the Gobi Desert in the West. In the US, if I take away all subsidies, 3 years ago, the cheapest solar we had without subsidies was about 8.5 cents. That was a record low price. 3 years later, now it's less than 3 cents with subsidies and just over 4 cents without any subsidies, cheaper than natural gas or coal, unsubsidized in the US. People sign long-term power purchase agreements for 20 years. That's the price of these in the US. They've dropped by a factor of 4 or 5 over the last 7 years. This is not usual in energy. And now, as you've seen, it's the rest of the world. India, 4.6 cents. That was earlier in the year. But in June, India got a new deal, 3.8 cents. That's about 20% cheaper than coal in India with no subsidies. And you see the price of solar in India has dropped by a factor of 4 in just 4 years. You have Mexico, 3.5 cent solar as of last year. You have Chile, 2.9 cents solar, half the price of the cheapest coal or gas in the world. And then you have this one, this record-setting deal that happened last year in Dubai, a long-term 25-year contract signed for solar power at 2.4 cents. That's less than half the price of the cheapest natural gas anywhere. And this is not just the record low price for solar. This is the cheapest unsubsidized contract for electricity anywhere on planet Earth, any time in history, with any technology. And it's not done. It's going to keep getting cheaper. And this wasn't just one company making a low bid. There were 4 companies that all bid less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour. This is an incredibly low price. Right? And so we've seen that solar has just grown enormously. It's grown by a factor of 50 in the last 10 years. The growth has been exponential. Plot a hockey stick on a logarithmic scale, and if you've got a straight line, that's an exponential, 35 to 40% growth per year. Now, as the previous speaker said, this will taper off. We don't know exactly when, but it's not sustainable that it will keep growing this fast indefinitely. But right now, it is an explosion. Put another way, it took 30 years for the world to get to 1% of its electricity made by solar. It's taken another 2.5 years to get to 2%, which will be sometime early next year. Right? And then it'll take another 3 years maybe to get to 4%. That's what exponential growth looks like, even if the growth rate is tapering a little bit. Now, of course, this is regional, and it depends upon how much sunlight you have. In the US, I live in Seattle, the upper left corner. It's the least sunny place in the continental US. We don't have a lot of solar. In the Southwest, the more sun you have, the cheaper it will be. So the Southwest and south of the US. In Europe, the south is the sunniest place, but Germany is where solar really started. It didn't make any geophysical sense. The Germans should have built solar in Spain and built transmission lines, but they wanted to go green, so they did, and that we owe them a big word of thanks, because that drove down the price. It drove us along that learning curve. And globally, if we look at what's happening, a couple things to note. 1.3 billion people don't have electricity today. Where do they live? Africa and South Asia. They live in some of the sunniest parts of the world. 75% of energy use growth will be in a small corner of this map that has China and India in it. Japan, well, we'll come back to Japan in just a moment. And so if we see each of these lines as a different country around the world, in every country where solar is being deployed, the price is coming down. Not always at the same rate, but it's a global phenomenon. And you see places that have sun similar to Japan. Germany is on the right of this graph, France, and you see the prices there plunging, and in some cases cheaper than what it is right now in Japan. So this is now what is disrupting coal around the world, this plus wind that we'll talk about. In January, China canceled plans for 104 coal power plants. These plants would have had an estimated total worth of $80 billion. 40 of them had already started construction. The ones in red had already started construction. At least $20 billion US spent, just written off. In India, in July, 14 gigawatts of coal power, about 10 big plants, all canceled. And the reason given was simple. The solar price is plunging so fast, it makes no sense to do this. And so you see, this is the coal pipeline, how many coal plants are in various phases. And they're all going down, except the last one is on hold. And that's the only category that has gone up. Those plants will never come out of on hold. They are dead. They just don't know it yet. And so this disruption is happening globally. Now, this disruption will happen in Japan as well. Japan is not the sunniest place on Earth, but it's a lot sunnier than other parts of the world, like Europe. In fact, here's Japan, here's Germany, has 41 gigawatts of solar, and here they are at the same geographic scale. And actually, this color scale is slightly biased against Japan. So Japan has more intense sunlight than Germany, actually, and really has come from behind, has made a concerted effort in the last few years. You see, Germany was the world's leader in solar power until 2015 when China overtook them. But Japan has sort of come from very low in the world to have a tremendous amount of solar deployed. And in 2016, Japan actually passed Germany and the US to be the #2 country in the world as far as the amount of solar deployed. So congratulations, very well done. But there are challenges ahead. Because of policy changes, it looks like the pace of deploying new solar may slow down, at least for a little while. So we need to think about the policy regime here. What does the grid pay for solar? Are those grid connections available? And there are also specific issues for Japan. Japan is a mountainous place, and so solar needs some land. You need about 1% of the land area of Japan to meet all of Japan's electricity needs with solar. You'll never get that far, but a lot of the land is mountainous. Now, this is a solar power plant in Spain. It can be done, but it's, of course, more complicated. So we need to look to other solutions. The rooftops of Japan are one thing. The rooftops of Tokyo, it is estimated, can produce about 20% of Tokyo's electricity needs with solar on them. And the cost of residential solar in Japan is these yellow dots plunging down below the cost of grid electricity, as the previous speaker mentioned. But it's not just homes, it's also commercial buildings that we see as a huge opportunity, and other sectors as well. Japan has been pioneering the world in floating solar. This is a project being pioneered on the Yamakura Dam by Kyocera, and in addition to using space that's not otherwise used, this actually slows evaporation of the water, and because these solar panels end up being cooled by the water, they run about 15% more efficiently. They actually generate more electricity. Here's an actual picture of Kyocera's solar floating system here. So a Japanese company pioneering the use of this. There's other opportunities around the world as well. The cost of a solar field is now only about 1/3 the solar panels. The labor, the deployment of the solar, that is now a very large fraction of the cost. So we look at what's the future of deploying large-scale solar. It's things like robotics, an area that Japan excels at. This is an actual solar deploying robot from a company called Alliance. It's a US company, but it's still not very good. There's huge opportunity for Japan to take its know-how in robotics and other areas and apply them to this global industry, not just to transform Japan, but to make a new source of revenue and new business opportunities. Now, of course, the sun doesn't always shine. So what do we do when the sun goes down? Well, You probably think I'm about to go talk about storage, and I will, but first I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about wind power, because wind is thus far a missed opportunity in Japan. And the reason I say that is that the wind and sun are complementary. They are anti-correlated. This is a graph from California. This is one day. In the middle of the day, the sun shines. Statistically, the wind blows more at the middle of the night and the least during the day. So you put them together and you can approximate the day's demand of energy. Or here in Germany, we have 11 months of the monthly output of solar and wind. And the sun shines most, of course, in the summer, and the wind blows most, of course, in the winter. And so for this reason, even as solar plunges in price faster than wind, wind will continue to grow because it's improving and because it works well. In fact, wind power is still larger around the world than solar power is. It's grown by 6.5% over 10 years. It'll be another 3 or 4 years before solar even catches up to wind. And even at that point, wind will keep growing. And it'll keep growing because it has its own exponential. In 1980, wind power cost 10 times what wholesale coal or natural gas cost. And now, in the US, you can purchase wind power contracts for 20 years for 4 cents a kilowatt hour in the windiest areas, or 4 yen a kilowatt hour, a 15 times cost reduction. This is not as fast as solar power, but it's still an exponential, and it's still a tremendous pace of progress. And as we build these larger and larger wind turbines, now larger than the biggest jets, a second thing happens, which is the wind grows more steady. That these larger turbines can spin and generate electricity in slower winds, so they start to look more and more like baseload power. We talk about the steadiness of an energy source as its capacity factor. And in 20, 30 years ago, capacity factors of the best wind turbines were maybe 10%. Now in windy places like the US Great Plains or parts of Japan, turbines that are 140 meters tall, larger than a football field, have 50%, 60% capacity factors. They work almost like baseload power, and that is a huge opportunity. Now, of course, again, it depends on what the wind is like. You don't build wind turbines in a place where there's no wind, right? And globally, there's variation around this, but there are some significantly good winds around Japan, and we'll drill into those in a moment. But despite that, in this list of the top 10 countries around the world for wind power, you don't see Japan at all. Here's Japan on the far left, compared to the rest of the world. Japan is severely lagging in this area, and in part it's the nature of the government programs that have optimized for small-scale wind when these large wind systems are really the ones that are much more economical. Now, the other scenario for Japan is not just wind on the land, but wind at sea. And wind offshore used to be prohibitively expensive, which is too bad because the fastest winds in the world and the fastest winds in Japan aren't actually on land. They're just a little bit off the land. You see the red areas here and the yellow areas. That's where the wind really blows most rapidly and also most steadily. So it gives you the cheapest wind power, the most wind power, and the wind power that's the most like baseload. Historically, however, these sorts of offshore wind turbines were incredibly expensive. You had to build them like you built oil platforms, and that was a large engineering task, harder to build a foundation for this offshore than on land. But that also has changed. Offshore wind is only about 1% of all wind power, so it's still very new. So as it goes through its own learning curve, the prices decline. And in just the last 3 years, the price of wind power has dropped roughly in half, of offshore wind power. And as the previous speaker mentioned, we now have situations just earlier this year in June, for the first time ever in Europe, we had a wind contract for 25 years signed at wholesale grid prices with zero subsidy whatsoever. And that's good news because this is not where it will stop. Now it will ratchet into a situation where it can grow on its own, and that will increase the learning curve and bring down the costs and allow it to tap into new markets and so on. And it's an opportunity for Japan. There are multiple offshore projects being done here in Japan. One complexity is that the land slopes down quite rapidly offshore in Japan, so we need to think about not just anchored offshore wind power, but floating wind power, which is an even newer technology, and there's multiple of these being tried in Japan. So this is an opportunity, and the price of wind power will keep dropping. So I know everyone here already knows about solar power, has already heard how amazing it is, but what I want to tell you is that wind is the natural complement for it. Now, with just wind and solar, Japan could probably meet 80%, maybe 70% of its electricity needs with nothing else. But eventually, you do need to store that energy. And here, Japan has a built-in advantage. Because of the mountainous nature of Japan, it is one of the world's leaders in hydropower and in what we call pumped hydroelectric storage, which is actually the cheapest storage anywhere on Earth, which is that when you have excess electricity, as the previous speaker's slides show, you run an electric pump that takes water from below the dam to above the dam. And then that's basically reserve energy waiting for you that you can dispatch whenever you need it. Japan has the most pumped hydroelectric storage of any nation on Earth, already built, just sitting there. And it used to be that the nuclear power plants would use their excess electricity at night to operate this. Well, now the solar and wind power can use it to store this energy. But this, while it is a ready resource Japan already has, is not exponential. What is exponential is the trend happening in batteries. Everybody know who this person is? Tony Stark? I made you laugh. That's hard to do in Japan sometimes. Elon here is introducing the Tesla Powerwall battery, a battery system for use at home or in buildings or in industry to store energy. But I'll tell you a secret. Maybe you know this already. Tesla doesn't actually make these batteries. These batteries are made by a Japanese firm. This is all Panasonic technology wrapped up in a Tesla case. And Panasonic is, in fact, the world's leader in lithium-ion batteries. It's not because of a sudden Tesla breakthrough that Tesla is able to sell this product. It's because batteries are an exponential technology whose price has been dropping for 20 years and will continue to drop. And what they enable people to do, if they're cheap enough, and they're just at the point where they're cheap enough to do this in some scenarios, is if you have a building, you have solar on the roof, you are generating excess electricity. The golden area is solar power you're generating that you're not using. The light yellow area is the area that you are using. So today, the model is you sell that back to the grid, you get a feed-in tariff, and then at night, when your appliances are on, your television is on, you're charging your laptop, you buy electricity back from the grid at whatever they charge of it. Now, today in Japan, the feed-in tariff is cheaper than what you have to pay. So you sell it to the grid at one price, and then you buy it back at 4 or 5 times more later on in the evening, in some cases. But what batteries allow you to do is to take that excess energy, store it for yourself, and then use it in the evening. And if batteries become cheap enough, then it doesn't matter what happens with the feed-in tariff. If you can store it yourself more cheaply, then you are at the point where, for at least a few hours of storage, that's worthwhile. These people are not going to cut the cord. We're not going to have people defect from the grid. Having your home be energy independent is not going to happen, just like my laptop is not going to be independent of the internet. But it does mean that you can use more energy from your own system and less from the grid, and that changes the relationship with the grid. The other thing that we see battery companies doing is energy price arbitrage. In many markets, electricity is cheap at one time, usually at night, because demand is low, and it's expensive at other times, middle of the day or late afternoon, because demand is high. So this is California. On the left is the cheapest time, 15 cents retail, and on the golden area is the most expensive. That's almost 20 US cents difference in price in this expensive market. So if a battery is cheaper than that, then you fill it up when energy is cheap, and you deploy from it. You use from it when energy is expensive. And now batteries cost about 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So they've just hit this point, and they will keep coming down. The price of lithium-ion batteries has dropped by 4 or 5 since 2010. and it has a learning curve nearly identical to that of solar. Solar's price decline is the green triangles. Batteries are the blue diamonds, lithium-ion batteries. And they both get cheaper at 20 to 25% cheaper per doubling of scale. So batteries are an exponential technology that have a huge way to go and will continue to plunge in price. In fact, they've already come down in price by about a factor of 20 over the last 20 years. If they come down in price another 5 to 10, then they will be deployed at a massive scale indeed. That's lithium-ion batteries. There's many other energy storage technologies in the pipe behind that in research labs and startups. This is a man named John Goodenough. He invented the lithium-ion battery. He has in his academic lab a battery that's solid state that has 3 times the capacity, lithium-ion. Might still be many years or a decade before commercialization. We have metal air batteries, lithium air batteries that can have 10 times the capacity per unit weight of lithium-ion batteries. Again, they're in the lab, they're not ready to be bought, they need many more years probably to be made durable and so on, but that's what's coming. Or for the grid scale, we don't care about weight, so flow batteries are similar in cost, but they can go for 10 times more cycles. Instead of a lifetime of 2 or 3 years, a lifetime of 20 or 30 years, lowering the total cost amortized over time. So many more developments to come. But all of this, step back and look at these trends in the learning curve, and you come to a strange conclusion. That conclusion is that clean energy will be cheaper in the long run than fossil fuel energy. And we've always assumed the opposite. We've always assumed that fossil fuels were the cheapest way to make energy, but that we should have clean energy for moral reasons, for environmental reasons, for health reasons. But the trends say something different than that. They say that because the cost of technology constantly drops, that the cost of energy produced by this exponential technology will be the cheapest. And now even very conservative organizations are saying this. This is the International Energy Agency, the IEA, the world's experts on energy. This is not what you would call an exponential organization. Okay? I will show you. Let me show you the IEA's forecasts for solar growth that they've made over time and changed year after year. Start at the bottom. In 2002, the IEA had this light blue line, said 50 gigawatts of solar by 2030. Then in 2004, they said, oh, that's a little bit low, we'll lift it. And then in 2006, they said, that's a little bit low, we'll lift it. And then in 2008, they said, it's a little bit low, we'll lift it. In 2009, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like someone is taking the same Excel spreadsheet and hitting copy and paste of their formula from year after year. Right? Now, the last line, the 2014 forecast, looks pretty good. Who believes that in 2014, the IEA, the world's experts in energy, have figured out that solar growth is exponential? Who believes that? Someone out there must have confidence in the IEA. Please help me out. You all know who the point of my joke is, because they haven't, because they project linear growth when it's still installations are going up 35 or 40% per year. So the forecasters have been systematically wrong for 20 years. The IEA has never once overestimated the growth of solar. They have every single forecast has underestimated it in more or less the same way. Yet the IEA now says solar will be the #1 source of electricity by mid-century. That across much of the world, solar's cost heading to 4 cents kilowatt hour. We've already seen some costs lower than that. And that rooftop solar would be, quote unquote, unbeatable because it doesn't need the cost of the grid. That's the IEA. Or Alliance Bernstein, this is a private equity firm in the US. They're purely finance, they're not environmentalists. The previous speaker showed this slide, but let me just emphasize it. Across the bottom are the cost of oil, coal, and gas over a 50 or 60-year period. And that gray line there, I think it was someone's child took a crayon and scrawled on this graph. Is that what that is? That is the cost of solar coming down over the long run. And they didn't put the right other lines on it, but that's the cost of wind power coming down. That's the cost of batteries coming down. This is a technological disruption happening. It's a little bit like Kodak being disrupted by film. A little bit. I don't want to overstate that. I do not believe cars will be gone in 8 years. Nothing like that. Because when we build this infrastructure, it's built to last for 30, 40, 50 years. This transition will still take decades. But the economic disruption happens when the peak happens of demand. Coal demand is still high, but it's gone down a few percent worldwide. That bankrupted several coal companies around the world. And so the economic disruption will happen even if we still have some coal and gas and oil being used. So all of that was about electricity. But let's talk about the other way that we use energy. We use energy to move ourselves around, right? If Japan's imports of fossil fuels, oil is the largest chunk. But oil will be disrupted. Sheikh Yamani said, the Stone Age didn't end for a lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil. This man was the Saudi oil minister during the oil crisis of the 1970s. He's warning his fellow princes, the world is going to create technology that disrupts oil. And I don't think he was listened to sufficiently, all right? Because we see that happening now. And in fact, it's 3 separate technologies combining to disrupt oil. One is autonomy, self-driving. Autonomous vehicles simply drive better than you or I are capable of driving. They can see things we can't see. They can respond in microseconds. They still have limitations. It will still take some years to get them ironed out, but they will simply take over driving. How many of you have ridden an autonomous vehicle? A couple? Let me show you what it's like. It might be a little different than your experience, sir. But let me show you what it's like to ride in an autonomous vehicle. And I apologize profusely for the profanity you'll hear in English.
Hans team will never believe this.
Oh my goodness. Go is the right word. Holy shit. Holy shit. There's no fucking hands on that wheel. Oh my god. What?
It's driving itself.
So those are the screams of the oil futures market, right? Maybe. Now, this morning, I got to ride in an autonomous vehicle, a robocar. You see here its system for showing what's happening. I rode with Daniel Kraft, who will be speaking tomorrow, and Will Weissman. And you can see we were terrified also. We were very, very frightened. No, we weren't scared at all because it's actually a very boring experience. It's actually a very safe driver. It's a very comfortable driver. It always obeys the law. Families and kids get in it because it's a better driver than you are. But it's also different because the number one inhibitor, the number one limiter of electric vehicles today is anxiety over range. But if your car can drive itself and can drive itself to a place to fill up, you don't have that anxiety. Second, rides as a service. You heard about TaaS, transport as a service. Again, when you get into a taxi, do you ever wonder how much gasoline is in the tank? Not typically. But there's a second phenomenon here, which is that when you use a taxi or an Uber, you are paying by the kilometer. And so you see a direct comparison of the per kilometer cost of the vehicle. And the per kilometer cost of electric vehicles is already cheaper than that of gasoline vehicles because the energy is cheaper, because the maintenance costs are much lower. And 3, electrification. Electric vehicles are just 0.2% of all vehicles on the road. There's 2 million electric vehicles around the world out of 1 billion cars. They are a minuscule effect. They're smaller than 1 pixel if I was to show overall energy use in transportation. But they are growing at more than 70% per year. And that's what matters most. And that's before the effects of self-driving and transport as a service have kicked in. Because what we'll see is that self-driving and transport as a service both take away the concern about range, and self-driving makes transport as a service cheaper and pushes people into that, and transport as a service makes you compare the price. And in 5 years or 10 years, the cost per kilometer in an electric vehicle will be half of what it is in an internal combustion vehicle. So are you going to call the gasoline vehicle that costs twice as much, or the quiet, sleek, futuristic, self-driving vehicle that's electric that costs half as much? So I don't think we'll all switch to transport as a service immediately. People will continue to own cars if they live in rural areas, especially if they have multiple vehicles for a family. But this segment will grow rapidly and will drive electrification. And we see it happening already. This year, this is the watershed year for electric vehicles, because the first Tesla, the Tesla Roadster, was a $250,000 US car. The Tesla Model S is an $80,000 to $90,000 US car. But now the Tesla Model 3 that started shipping last month is a $35,000 US car, before you add things on. That's the base price. And it's not just one manufacturer, it's a dozen manufacturers, or at least a dozen models of vehicles coming out that are pushing for $30,000, maybe even pushing down to $25,000, $20,000, with ranges of 250 kilometers or more. And in fact, just yesterday in the hotel, the Grand Nikodaiba, they had the announcement of the Nissan Leaf 2018. Just a few hundred meters from here, and this is a less than $30,000 car with a slightly shorter range than the Tesla, 240 kilometers. That starts to push into mainstream use, and it will just keep coming down. Now, again, I want to pick on the forecasters. In the US, we have something called the EIA. It's like the International Energy Agency, but for the US. They made a forecast. How many electric vehicles would there be in the US with a 200-mile range or larger, a 320-kilometer range or larger? This is a 2015 forecast. And they, if you can't see it, it's the red line. If you can't see it, I don't blame you. It's so close to zero. They said there would be about 20,000 electric vehicles in the US with a 200-mile range by 2040. There's more than that already. Tesla is on track to sell 500,000 of the Model 3s. They had 500,000 pre-orders. 500,000 people gave Tesla $1,000 for a pre-order of this vehicle. So you have to bet on the innovators and not the forecasters. And as we sell more electric vehicles, their largest cost is batteries. As we sell more of the batteries, what happens to the battery costs? They go down. And as the cost goes down, we sell more vehicles. And as we sell more vehicles, the increased scale brings down the prices. And as the prices come down, they hit a larger market. So again, we have that virtuous cycle going on. And ultimately, they may be the cheapest vehicles. They may actually be much cheaper than internal combustion vehicles, because this is the entire engine and drivetrain of an electric vehicle. It has 10 times fewer moving parts than a gasoline vehicle. And so if we take the learning curve, electric vehicles get cheaper about 16% per doubling. If we take that learning curve and apply it to a growth rate half as fast as they're growing now, then you take an average US car price, $33,000. The cheapest car in the US is the green line, a two-seater smart car, $14,000. You have a car like the Tesla Model 3, a five-seater car that performs like a sports car, that has self-driving features, being cheaper than a two-seater smart car by about 2030. So again, I think predicting 8 years out that we're out of internal combustion cars, I don't believe that at all. It takes 20 years to rotate that fleet. But I think that by 2030, electric vehicles may be 75 or 80% or 90% of new vehicle sales. Right. And in fact, we see policy pushes. Beijing decided earlier this year that they were going to convert all 70,000 of their taxis to become electric. Right? India, the energy minister of India, decided to one-up that. So last month, he announced that India intended to have only electric vehicles sold in that entire nation by 2030. And some European nations have followed suit, but India is really the big story here. And so then if you go through what that does to oil demand, as the previous speaker said, at some point we see a peak of demand. Not a collapse, not that demand for oil goes to zero, but at some point it stops growing and it becomes a shrinking market. And if the oil market is shrinking, the cost of oil goes to the bottom and stays there. And in fact, it's not just, that was a graph from Bloomberg, it's large multinational oil companies now saying this. Shell announced that they see peak oil demand happening in the next 10 to 15 years. That was earlier this year. And then a month ago or so, Total, the French oil supergiant, announced that they saw peak oil demand happening in between 2025 and 2030. And in fact, they are now starting a new business in the US to do more direct energy work because they need to get out of just oil or diversify away from just oil. And this has severe ramifications. If you're a nation that gets 90% of its foreign revenue, 91% from oil, what happens to Saudi Arabia? I don't know. It's not going to be good. That's disruption right there. Or if your nation like Russia gets 70% of your export revenue comes from oil and gas, what happens to Russia? And what are the ramifications for the whole world if this country sees declining revenue and perhaps behaves badly as a result? The good news for Japan is it would save Japan $50 billion a year in exports. I want to close by asking how you can take action in an area like this, or any exponential area, truly, but especially in energy. A crisis is both danger and opportunity. All right, that is how we think of it. And I haven't even mentioned this crisis that's brewing. The world is heating up. The planet is getting warmer. 2014 was the hottest year on record on planet Earth. 2015 was the hottest year on record on planet Earth, beating 2014. 2016 was the hottest year on record on planet Earth, beating 2014 and 2015. 3 of them in a row. 2017 will probably go down a little bit. We'll have a few years of no new records. And then again, in 8 or 10 years, we'll set another string of record warms. And if we want to stay under 2 degrees Celsius, the amount that scientists have said is healthy. I was just in Kyoto, by the way, just before I came here. The Kyoto Protocol was on my mind when I was there. If we want to stay under 2 degrees Celsius, we have to leave most fossil fuels in the ground. If you look at all of the world's fossil fuel reserves, oil, gas, and coal, how much of that can we burn and stay under 2 degrees Celsius? We can burn about 25% of it. The other 3/4 of it have to stay in the ground. But those assets, those oil reserves, coal reserves, gas reserves, they are on the balance sheets of corporations, they're on the balance sheets of sovereign nations. What happens if you wipe out that value? That's $22 trillion in one estimate. What happens if you make that go to zero? Is that a bubble bursting, like the property bubble that burst in 2007? What does that do to the global economy? So that's a risk also. And in fact, 22 trillion might be conservative. Citi came out, again, purely financially focused, came out with a report earlier this year that said that the stranded assets, the value of all resources that could not be utilized in a clean energy future, in a future consistent with non-dangerous climate change, was more like 100 trillion. Not 100 trillion yen, 100 trillion US, 10 quadrillion yen. You ever heard a number that big before in terms of money? I haven't, really. I don't have anything that big. So that's a major bubble waiting to be burst. But it's creative destruction. In chaos, in disruption, there is also opportunity. I come at this as an investor. I invest in early stage energy startups. It's one of the things that I do. I got into that by talking about energy at events like this, looking at the trends, and startups coming to me and saying, will you help us, will you be involved? And so I look at this in terms of where is there a gap? Where is there a situation where a customer has an unmet need or where there's value sitting on the table? Maybe that value is in the future and you need to find a way for it to appear financially for the customer right now. Maybe the value is something that can only be realized if multiple parties band together in some way. It's a business model innovation. Right? And in fact, that's what we see. If we look at how solar on rooftops grew, it was really a combination of innovation in 3 areas. 1, technology innovation. We talk about that all the time. 2, policy innovation. Important, we understand that. But 3, the missing ingredient often, business model innovation. New business models that allowed people to realize a profit or a cost savings for customers and make some money off of that. Right? We see all 3 of these together. Technology innovation. The cost of solar has plunged. Great, that's technology. Now, driven by policy, driven by the Germans subsidizing it initially, but still technology. Policy innovation. The Germans started the feed-in tariff. You have one in Japan. In the US, we call it net metering, tax breaks. This is a policy change that accelerated this sector. But they came together when people found business model innovations. So Elon Musk, we've already talked about here a few times, he and his cousin, wanted to start a business in solar. But they didn't want to be a manufacturer of solar panels. They knew that was a very tough business. So they said, what's a gap? What's a missing opportunity? They said, okay, we know that if you deploy solar panels in California, let's say, they will pay themselves off in 5 years. It's a 15, 18% rate of return. That's fantastic. But very few homeowners had $15,000, $20,000 US to invest in it. And even if they didn't like a 5-year payback. That did not look good to a homeowner. So it's fine. We'll have a business model innovation. We will close the gap. We will finance the solar. We'll provide the solar to the customer for free. They will pay us a monthly fee. But over the lifetime of that investment, it will generate far more revenue. And we will skim that revenue. We'll give half the savings to the customer, and half of it we will realize as profits for ourselves. That company became worth $4 billion US and was eventually merged with Tesla, worth more than $40 billion US. So often we see that these three things, policy, technology, and business, go hand in hand. In fact, one accelerates the other. German policy drove solar to scale, which drove down the technology, which made new businesses possible, which then gives more policy influence, right? But what's missing in many of these cases is someone to say, I can make this wheel spin, I'm going to be a leader. And the leaders who take that risk, many of them fail. They launch new companies that don't work out. But a few of them reap opportunities of billions and billions of dollars. So for that reason, that alignment of what's good for the planet and what's good for the people and what's good for business, I believe the future is very bright. Thank you very much.
Thank you.